Hi everyone, and welcome to the second edition of This Week in Immigration, our dive into the biggest stories in immigration policy. I'm Jordan Lapierre.
And I'm Hunter Hallman. We're cutting through the noise, helping you make sense of what matters and why during this incredibly busy time in the world of immigration policy.
You can subscribe to this podcast and all of BPC's podcasts on iTunes, or stream on our website at bipartisanpolicy.org.
And while you're there, you can find more information about all the topics we discuss on the podcast. Just go to bipartisanpolicy.org/immigration.
On the podcast this week, the White House releases its framework for a DACA deal, the latest data on immigration apprehensions, and an overview of the biggest trends in immigration and why they matter in the current debate.
Let's start with the White House DACA framework. BPC's Director of Immigration and Cross-Border Policy, Theresa Brown, is with us to walk through the details. Theresa, let's start with a quick rundown of what the White House is asking for in this DACA deal.
So, the White House, after having dinners with both Republican and Democratic members of Congress to lay out what might be a deal on DACA and Dreamers over the weekend of the holiday weekend in Columbus Day, released a 7-page document outlining what they would like to see in immigration law. What's unclear about this document, before I get into the details, is whether or not this is actually what they want to see in a DACA deal or whether this is a larger list of things they eventually would like Congress to get to. But it pretty much covers the gamut. It includes everything from a border wall to interior enforcement and more ICE agents. It covers things like tightening up on the asylum system, increasing detention, allowing people to be returned faster to their countries of entry. It's all over the place. And very early on after it was released, there were Democrats in Congress who said it's way too much, so we'll see.
So were any of those asks a surprise, and why?
Well, many of them are ideas that have been either part of past legislation or legislation that has passed one house of Congress or the other in the past. Things like some of the interior enforcement efforts that would, for example, increase the sentencing of immigrants who return after being removed and who have criminal convictions. That's commonly known as Kate's Law. There are other provisions that would increase the authority of state and local law enforcement to enforce immigration law, and that's been part of things that have been passed in the past. And so a lot of it, including the border wall, were things that President Trump had campaigned on. So I wouldn't say there was a lot of surprise in terms of the content. What maybe was a surprise is that the idea that all of this could be done in exchange for DACA or DREAM, which I think a lot of people may be skeptical of.
So, Theresa, how does this differ from the outlines of a deal we heard after that now famous dinner with Chuck and Nancy that you mentioned from about, I guess it's been about a month ago now?
Well, after that dinner, the outlines of the deal that seemed to be there, and again, we weren't in the room, so we're not entirely sure, was that a permanent solution for the Dreamers that would grant them status would be paired with some form of border security, but not the wall. Well, the White House document goes well beyond border security, as I mentioned. It includes a lot of things relating to interior enforcement. It includes provisions about asylum and refugee processing and visa processing overseas that were well beyond the contours of what that deal might look like.
So obviously this new framework is a starting point. Do you see any red lines here? Anything that makes a deal harder to reach in the long run?
Well, whether or not it's a starting point or an end point depends on who you talk to about the White House. One thing this White House is unclear about is what this really means. I think many Democrats came out very strongly against all of it in the aftermath of it being released. Many of them, including Senator Schumer and Representative Pelosi, issued a statement saying these are non-starters and that they need to go back to the framework that had been discussed with the president in their dinner. That having been said, there are groups of members on both the House and the Senate in the Republican conferences that are working on what they think is a deal that can pass Congress, recognizing that at least in the Senate, where you need 60 votes to get anything done, there will have to be Democratic votes that can come along board with this. So at some point, people will have to get down to brass tacks and figure out what deal can happen. And I think a lot of this is just going to be too much for this kind of a deal. If everyone really wants to see the Dreamers helped in a short turnaround time before their status expires in March, maybe asking for the moon is not the best way to get there.
So that brings up a different or related question, I think, which is, has this proposal from the White House poisoned the well? Has it made a deal impossible?
I don't think it makes a deal impossible. Again, it depends on how solidly the White House is going to stick to this. Is it an opening gambit, or is this something the president absolutely has to have? What we have seen from the president in the past on negotiations is he's always started out with a really hard line and then maybe later said things that sort of say, well, maybe I don't have to have this or that. So I think it's too soon to tell whether any of this is going to be a hard line that the president will want in order to sign something, or whether it's his chance at trying to get everything he possibly can. We'll see.
So the flip side of all these questions about how much farther this framework went than what we expected is, was there anything that wasn't included in the White House framework that we thought might be?
Well, they included legal immigration reforms, the RAISE Act that President Trump had touted when Senators Cotton and Perdue introduced it about 2.5 months ago. It covers the gamut pretty wildly. What it doesn't have in here, though, is anything saying what exactly he wants on Dreamers or DACA. It is all the other side of the equation. It's all the what we would do as part of a deal to get DACA and Dreamers permanent status. So the fact that there's no details on that side either is also a little curious.
So where do we go from here? What happens next?
I think what happens next is that we're going to see how this plays out in Congress. As I said, there's some groups of Republicans who are working on seeing what kind of legislation their own conference will accept. The Democrats are sort of waiting to see the outcome of that process to see who's going to talk to them about what they need to get on board. As I said, at the end of the day, there has to be a bipartisan vote on this. It will probably come at the same time that Congress is trying to figure out how to pay for the government for another year and pass a lot of other legislation that is needed before the end of 2017 to make sure that things keep running smoothly. So the Democrats may have some leverage, particularly if they do as they have promised, which is to withhold their votes on some of these other must-pass legislation unless a deal for Dreamers is included.
Theresa, while you're here, I want to ask you an unrelated question. Last week, the Supreme Court dismissed one of the legal challenges to President Trump's travel ban. Can you just explain quickly what the significance of that move is?
Sure. So I think, as I mentioned the last time we talked about the travel ban, on September 24th, the administration issued what it's calling its new proclamation on visas and entry, that folks are colloquially calling the new travel ban. This was the culmination of all of the work that had been done since the original executive orders were issued to try to figure out what else the government might need to screen and vet people. The Supreme Court asked all of the parties in the pending litigation whether the issuance of that document made the current case moot. In other words, now that the previous travel bans were no longer in effect, we have a new one. Does the litigation that previously had been undertaken still matter? And the Supreme Court answered that question affirmatively, at least in one of the cases, no, it no longer matters. So they dismissed that part of the case, sent it back to the underlying district court to say, basically we revoke your decision, and the plaintiffs would have to start over on that piece. There's a second case that's coming out of a different circuit that's still technically at the Supreme Court. We have to wait and see how that goes. That deals more specifically with refugees, and that wasn't dealt with as much in this latest executive order. However, the new travel order from September 24th already has its share of litigation against it now. So my guess is we will see additional cases making their way up to the Supreme Court over time.
So that's probably where we turn our attention to the cases against the travel ban as it exists now.
Yeah, that's going to be the next round of litigation, and this could all play out over the next weeks, months, even years.
Okay, well, I'm sure we'll talk about it again on the podcast. Thanks, Theresa.
Yeah.
For our next conversation, I'm actually going to turn to my co-host here on the podcast. Hunter, you wrote a blog post last week taking a look at the latest data on border apprehensions. Mm-hmm. The rhetoric around those border apprehensions lately has been that numbers are on the rise. A lot of reports earlier this year that more people were being apprehended than ever and that border crossings were at an all-time low. What are some of the factors that have led to the increase in border apprehensions in the last few months?
So first of all, Jordan, while it's true that border apprehensions have been on the rise in the last few months, this is coming after apprehensions precipitously dropped after January of this year. And there's multiple factors that play into that, such as the growth of the Latin American economy, increased settling in Mexico, and of course the Trump administration's enforcement priorities that were put in place after his inauguration, which was in January. However, we have seen an increase in apprehensions in recent months, but it's sort of along the lines of what we expect year to year.
So tell me about those trends. Where does this fit in with the trends? How does what we're seeing this year compare?
Sure. So, as you remember, 2014 and 2016, we saw huge increases in apprehensions of Central American children and families. This year's numbers, we're not really seeing that. We are seeing increases in apprehensions of these children and families from Central America, but it's just not to that scale. And there's factors that we expect to see in these summer months, such as warmer climates and less harsh conditions at the border that kind of play into those apprehensions seeing an uptick.
Some news outlets are saying that these numbers represent a surge at the border. Do you consider that to be an accurate representation of what we're seeing?
I think to answer that, it's useful to look at these numbers in sort of the larger context that these stories tend to leave out. Since fiscal year 2010, we haven't seen apprehensions at the southwest border total above 500,000. And we haven't seen them hit the 1 million mark since 2006, which is actually really significant because in the 1990s until about 2001, a million or about a million was what you could expect for apprehensions. So when you compare that with our 2017 total of less than 300,000 apprehensions at the southwest border so far, I don't really think it indicates a surge so much as kind of a predictable seasonal increase at the border.
So often this issue of border apprehensions is tied to Mexico and to Mexican immigrants crossing the border. Is that in keeping with what we're seeing in this latest data?
Definitely not. And that's actually one of the more popular misconceptions about the immigration debate right now. And like you said, we have a blog coming out on this soon, so I definitely encourage everyone to take a look because the visual is actually quite staggering. Because not only are Mexican immigrants no longer the majority of illegal border crossers, but it's striking to look at how sheer the number has dropped in border crossers from Mexico, whereas the number of border crossers from other countries has increased at a relatively very small amount.
So if we're going to take some big impressions away from all this data, what would they be?
So I think, of course, there's always room for improvement on border security. For example, we at Bipartisan Policy Center are big advocates for a better metrics database tracking entries and exits. But if you look at the data in context, we are doing something right consistently, despite certain months of the year showing upticks in apprehensions.
Okay, thanks, Hunter.
No problem. Finally today, we're unpacking the biggest trends in immigration and why they provide important context for the ongoing policy debate. Again today, we have Cris Ramon talking about this subject with us. Cris, how has this debate over undocumented immigration overlooked key trends in this type of immigration? And what are the policy implications for understanding the key forms of undocumented immigration?
So, first of all, like you were saying in the last segment, I think one of the key misconceptions about undocumented immigration into the U.S. Revolves around the perception that individuals are crossing the border illegally. If you actually look at the data, you will see that visa overstays, when people overstay their visas even by a day or weeks or months or years, is actually the principal form of undocumented immigration these days. Whereas, as you noted, in terms of border apprehensions, that has significantly dropped off. If you were looking at fiscal year 1997, we had 1.4 million apprehensions, and now that's dropped down to 300,000 to 500,000 since 2010. And that's actually, that's really, really significant. Now, if you're thinking about the policy implications, that's really important because, you have a robust debate about border security. You're having the president talk about his wall, you're talking about different ways to deter individuals from crossing the border illegally, but then if you're really thinking about targeting undocumented immigration, really what you need to be doing is targeting visa overstays. So, E-Verify might be one way of looking at it, but also visa entry and exit systems in order to ensure that you're finding the individuals who are overstaying. So, from a policy perspective, if you actually wanted to address the true source of undocumented immigration, it would have to revolve around the visa system. It's not to say that border security isn't important, but I think you need to recalibrate how you're thinking about enforcement measures, given what you've been seeing with the data.
Sure. So one of our big buzzwords here at BPC is demographics. So what about the demographics of our current immigration population? How has that changed over the last 20 years?
That's also been really, really significant. Once again, misconception, a lot of immigrants are coming from Mexico. Mm-hmm. And that's just simply not the case. What you're seeing is, just in terms of numbers, you're seeing more immigrants from Asia, from Asian countries, coming to the United States than compared to Mexico. So if you're looking at the numbers, the Mexican share of foreign-born in the United States has only increased by 2% in the last 20 years. And I think that's just really important to understand because, once again, the idea is that immigrants are coming from Mexico. Now, if you're looking at Latin America, you do see individuals coming from Central America, the unaccompanied children issue that's been coming up, driven by a lot of the violence in these countries. That's been, I think, an important component of immigration from Latin America. So, once again, a lot of misconceptions about what immigration looked like as opposed to what it actually looks like now.
You mentioned violence in some countries being a driver of some of these changes in demographics, but what are some of the other drivers behind this shift toward more Asian immigration and less from Central and Latin America?
Obviously, you'll be looking at different components such as economic growth in the United States, looking at family migration, individuals who move to the United States. Obviously, we'll be bringing individuals into, given that we do have a robust family immigration system. And, if you look at over the course of time, obviously the strength of different Asian economies has also impacted that as well. So I think it's just looking at different trends that would bring immigrants here from those countries that I think are largely economic, and you have some family connections as well.
So what does the data show about the role of immigrants in the American workforce?
So immigrants form 17.3% of the U.S. labor force. That's really significant. And another key point with immigrants and labor force is also education. Basically, what you have is between 2011 and 2015, nearly half of all new immigrants were college graduates. And this is pretty important because if you're looking at the U.S. workforce, it's aging rapidly. Individuals who are now retiring, baby boomers are retiring as well. And what immigrants are able to bring as they form a significant portion of the workforce is that they're able to bring in their skills, and they're of working age, so they're able to make important contributions to the economy. And this is really important, especially compared to, say, countries in Asia or in Europe, where we have rapidly aging populations, but you may not have significant levels of immigration to be able to sustain that growth, or they don't have significant levels of births to be able to offset their aging population. So I think that that's something that's really important to understand about the role of immigrants in the U.S. economy.
Definitely. Are there any sort of other policy implications we should be on the lookout for this kind of data?
Absolutely. I think what you've been seeing here recently in D.C. is a discussion about the RAISE Act. Mm-hmm. The RAISE Act is being promoted as a merit-based system to promote high-skilled immigration. But basically the act, really limits a lot of visa categories that then limit the number of immigrants who are able to come here and be able to, contribute their skills and their abilities to the U.S. economy. And these are, and that's not just simply skills and abilities, but this is actually a real dollar value. If you are able to boost immigration, BPC has found that, boosting immigration can reduce the federal deficit by $1.2 billion over 20 years. So it's not just simply that they're bringing in skills and that they're bringing in their abilities, but they're also bringing in, I think, very significant economic contributions to the United States. So that's, I think, important to understand with the policy discussions as well.
Chris, that brings to mind another question. You mentioned economic impact. How do visa categories like EB-5 and other investor visas fit into this?
I mean, that's also brings back the fact that if you're able to attract more individuals who are able to and bring in their investments or bring in their entrepreneurial abilities to be able to grow the economy, create businesses, obviously I think that's going to be very significant. It's obviously there's a lot of discussions about tightening those regulations, and like I said, once again, you need to keep into account the fact that will this be able to allow individuals to be able to bring in their skills and abilities. But it's not just simply EB-5. I think it's important to know that other research shows that even individuals who are falling out of this category, who are, immigrants who are coming from other visa categories or family immigration, do start their own businesses at higher levels even compared to native born. So I think it's, when you're talking about entrepreneurialism among immigrants and their economic impact, you really need to take a look at the whole population.
Great. Thanks so much, Chris.
And that wraps it up for this week's episode. Before you go, take a second to connect with us on Facebook by searching Bipartisan Policy Center, or on Twitter at @BPC_bipartisan. We'd love to see your questions for our immigration experts on either of those platforms, and we'll try to answer them for you next week.
And don't forget to subscribe to this podcast as well as all of BPC's podcasts on iTunes by searching Bipartisan Policy Center. And we'll see you back here next week.